let's start with this kind of basic questions for those people who either did not read the book or want to have a short summary. So why do nations fail?
I think the first thing to see is you have to get the meaning of the word fail right. So there's lots of different sorts of failure, but we're really talking about economic failure. Why is it that some countries are much more successful economically than other countries? They're much more successful at generating high levels of living standards for their people. And to us, that's about, the theory of the book is about, that's the way the societies themselves self-organize, the what we call the institutions, the rules that create incentives and opportunities for people. So there's a lot of theories out there about how societies can be intrinsically poor or intrinsically rich depending on their geography or their natural resource endowments. But in our view, that's very unimportant relative to the institutions of the society. So that's the sort of the first layer of the book, is about how institutions are critical for economic development. But what explains all the variation in institutions in the world is the politics of different societies. So there's two levels. There's the economics and there's the politics.
Which you believe supersede economic success or failure?
I think that's what determines economic success or economic failure. So for me, there's no intrinsic reason why a country like the Ukraine wouldn't have exactly the same living standards as the United States or Canada, except for the fact that it's lived for its history under very different sorts of institutions that haven't created the kind of incentives and opportunities for the average Ukrainian for them to do the things that every economist knows makes a society prosperous: invest, innovate, save.
Well, we will definitely return to that. And thanks God, I think, and thank you, you do not mention Ukraine in your book, because, being mentioned in the book Why Nations Fail, I would rather be mentioned in the book Why Nations Succeed, as the work we have to do with Timothy yet in the future, and with your help. But anyway, if I may ask you, I mean, what inspired the theme? What inspired the book? What inspired your thinking?
Well, Professor Asimoglu and I, we've been doing academic research on this topic. We've been talking about it ever since we first met, which is 26 years ago, basically. And early on in our career, we were very inspired. We were just overwhelmed by the extent to which economists were thinking about this, either in the wrong way, in the case of, say, Jeffrey Sachs, who was obsessed with all this geographical argument, or in a very superficial way, which was, if you want to be successful, you have to invest in education and you have to save, and okay, fine, but that's not manna from heaven. That's people responding to incentives, or governments responding to incentives, deciding to invest in public goods, or deciding to invest in the education system, or deciding to enforce antitrust regulation or intellectual property rights law. Or so we wanted to dig into a kind of deeper level of this explanation for comparative economic development, and present it in a way, first of all, that was appealing to academic economists, but then I suppose we've been trying to reach a broader audience in the last few years.
And then you elaborate especially on the example of North and South Korea, that share the same geography, share the same culture, and yet produce completely different results. And you also mentioned the city which is divided by border, the part in the U.S., part in Mexico, and vastly different results.
Yeah, Nogales, yes. I mean, that's what we call, natural experiments in social science. It's like an experimental variation. You're not manipulating it like you would a real experiment, like a medical doctor would do, or a physicist or something. But it's a sort of experiment-like variation in the real world. So we use those examples to sort of drive home, what kind of explanation could really be consistent with what you see in Korea, or what you see on the border between Mexico and the US. And I think that turns out to be a very powerful sort of tool for driving the point of the book home.
Right. And again, your main point is institutions and politics. Let's take the institutions part. What specifically are we talking about primarily? What kind of institutions?
Well, I think there's lots of different institutions, and that's part of the part of the complicated thing is if you look at different countries in the world or different parts of the world, institutional details differ a lot, because of different histories, different culture, different advice, different politics. So you need a kind of language for cutting through all of these differences. If I start talking about North Korea and South Korea, you might say, oh, well, of course, North Korea was socialist, so that's why it's economically unsuccessful. But the book is not about socialism and capitalism. In fact, from our perspective, North Korea has a lot in common with other countries which are as unsocialist as you could imagine, in Africa or in Latin America. So what is it that, unites North Korea with the Democratic Republic of Congo? Not socialism, but what we call extractive institutions. So with an economy and economic institutions which are designed to concentrate wealth and prosperity in the hands of people who can exercise power and set the system up like that, but that's at the expense of the prosperity of the society more generally. So we have this language of extractive institutions in North Korea or inclusive institutions in South Korea, and I can also give you some more specific examples of what we mean, if that would be helpful.
Please do.
Yeah. So in talking about the difference between the United States and Mexico, I always think we always give the example which I find really gets the point across is that if you look at arguably the two richest men in the world, or they were when we wrote the book, Bill Gates and Carlos Slim. So these people have enormous fortunes, and you ask yourself, how do they make the money? Okay, well, Gates made his money through innovating. So we know, economists have known since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s that it's innovation that drives prosperity. And what was the Industrial Revolution? It was all about innovation. So that's what Gates did. How did Carlos Slim make his money? Monopolies. In fact, the OECD calculated that the cost to the Mexicans of his monopolies just in a 5-year window was $129 billion, so far more than over double his fortune. So this is not just taking money from Mexicans and giving it to Carlos Slim. This is a very conservative estimate also of the costs. It's impoverishing Mexicans at the same time. But this is not a story about, Bill Gates, good guy, hero, inventor, because he wanted to be a monopolist too. It's just more difficult to be a monopolist in the United States.
But Professor, to be honest, Microsoft was under antitrust investigations back in the 90s.
Microsoft was found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. But that procedure is unimaginable in Mexico.
Exactly. So that is the example of inclusive institution that takes care of competition on the market and equal access to the market.
Yeah, I think the story is not that Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, they're both very clever, very energetic people, but the institutions in the United States push people in the direction. You want to make money, what do you do? It's hard to set up monopolies. You push people in the direction of innovation in what's socially desirable. But in Mexico, yeah, you could innovate, but it's much easier to make money through connections to politicians and get them to privatize a monopoly to you. And
basically, even if you create a monopoly yourself through your entrepreneurial success, not necessarily through the preferred access to government resources, right? But again, your point is, if I understand it correctly, is that then these monopolists try to protect their monopolies, which is natural. I mean, we see it in this country, we see it.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, Bill Gates tried to protect his monopoly too.
Absolutely.
It's the institutions who then worked hard, to either to break it down, which they did not succeed, or at least to create the equal opportunities for other companies, to catch up, which is Apple, for example, or Dell, or other countries. Companies to succeed to catch up with Microsoft.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of concern at the moment. We just had a very big conference at the business school in Chicago, just trying to think about, Google and Facebook, and how do we think about regulating these companies? And these are just enormous. These in a way which we've hardly ever seen before because of globalization. And how do we think about a regulatory framework for dealing with all of these market structure issues surrounding these new internet companies?
And there is a huge concern that they are turning into monopolies
Absolutely.
if they're not ones by now.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, well, before we get into Google's and Facebook, I mean, let's return to Ukraine in this segment. Well, so what's your explanation regarding Ukraine? What's wrong? Why we are more in this league than in the successful league?
Well, why are you more in the extractive institutions than the inclusive institutions? And that's history, isn't it? I mean, a lot of our book is, we try to explain the logic of extractive and inclusive institutions, but we also try to explain, why does the world look the way it does? Why is it that inclusive institutions happen to be concentrated in some parts of the world and not in other parts of the world?
And by the way, why?
Well, I mean, there's many historical processes at work, but a big part of the story is European colonialism. Well, here you didn't have European colonialism; you had Russian colonialism. Right. So Ukraine, it seems, is a country that's been, or it's a nation that's been struggling to find a country for centuries.
I worked for more than 3 years in Malaysia, which you do mention 3 times in your book. And it's a huge difference in this regard. What part of the empire you used to be. There are many other common denominators that we have with that country, corruption included. But the heritage of English law, for example, or English British parliamentarism institutions, they're plus English language, which is not just semantic,
right?
Obviously leaves the mark.
Yeah. So if I was going to start talking about Ukraine, I think you have to start by, where would extractive institutions have come from? Well, most obviously they came from the Soviet period. The Soviet Union had extremely centralized, autocratic state. It had very extractive economic institutions, highly dysfunctional, enormous amounts of informality and kind of gaming the system. So, so people were used to breaking the rules. That's how you survived in the Soviet Union. I think if you look at the structure of the Soviet economy and polity, it's very easy to see how you're going to inherit all sorts of potentially extractive institutions.
Professor, you finished the first segment with the notion of importance of history more than importance of geography and culture, if I may say so, explaining why it is so difficult, to turn Ukraine from failure into success. You wanted to elaborate on that?
I could, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying anything about it. It seems to me that Ukraine has been struggling, it's been struggling since the 1990s, struggling to create a more inclusive society. Many, and you had the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution. To me, those are both attempts to reverse extractive institutions, and so it's just a difficult process,
So we had this conversation earlier about the nation of Ukraine, that Ukraine doesn't really have a recent history prior to 1990s of being a nation, several years in the beginning of the 20th century. And also you have people who speak different languages within the country who are at the same time consider themselves to be Ukrainian. So there is this puzzle of the strong national identity despite not having a unified language and having different cultural backgrounds in different areas and not having a recent history of a successful state. And yet why there is such a strong national pride and national identity, or maybe we're still searching for it. So have you seen other countries, or do you have an explanation since our conversation why that might be happening?
No, I hope you were going to explain that to me.
I see. Why?
I was just observing how interesting I felt that was. I was making the comparison to the Finns. But the Finns have this extremely unique. Finland, that was a kind of identity and a culture without it ever having had a nation state until after the First World War, I guess. Right. But then it's easier to understand that case because the Finnish language is so different and distinct from anything around there. It's a kind of pre-Indo-European language. But that
especially from Russian, just to be specific and Swedish. So basically, I mean, it's
Extremely
different from
different.
both. Yeah,
Yes,
it's
extremely
both
different from-
neighboring
yes,
languages.
extremely different from Russian and Swedish. So I don't know that. I think the Ukrainian, it's extremely interesting this fact about Ukrainian nationalism and where it. But I don't know enough about the history to be able to really comment on where it could have come from. What is it that brings people together?
Well, that's something for us, of course, to elaborate. But Professor Robinson, you mentioned about glorious revolution in England, and you just mentioned that Ukraine went through, well, you say two, I would say this independence revolution in a way, although it was peaceful, of 91. So I would say
also.
3 revolutions by now. And you mentioned England's glorious revolution is the moment when the country shifted decisively towards inclusive political and economic institutions. What is this? I mean, it was long time ago, 300 years ago, more than 300 years ago. Yet, is there something to learn for Ukrainians from England's glorious revolution, how to move from extractionist institutions to inclusive?
Well, I think one thing to learn actually is that it takes quite a long time to get it right. You know, the English took a long time to get it right. You know, they were struggling against extractive institutions for most of the 17th century. And if you go to the 1640s and look at the English Civil War, in many ways that was an unsuccessful attempt to eliminate extractive institutions. You know, in the 1660s there was a kind of restoration. You sort of had that after the Orange Revolution, a restoration.
Yes.
And then there was further struggles against the crown and culminating in the Glorious Revolution. So I think that's true in many contexts, and you learn from your failures also. So I don't think that's not a bad thing to not have succeeded. I think it's inevitable. I think most processes of institutional change, even in the United States, in some sense, there was the Constitution, but before the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. That didn't work very well at all. So I think one lesson is, the fact that you have to keep trying. That's very typical historically, and you learn from your mistakes, and that's all part of the process, it seems to me. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's an inevitable thing. I think the key thing about the Glorious Revolution, is what we point out in the book. Why did this lead to such a change and a movement away from these extractive political institutions to much more inclusive? What we point out is it's what we call the emergence of a broad coalition. Now, what's interesting about the Glorious Revolution is how many people sort of united against this absolutist monarchy. It was a very broad cross-section of society, not just, there was William the Conqueror, but there was business elites, there were mercantile elites, there were poor people, there were landowners, and so it was a very, and that's an important message, in the sense of, if you want to change Ukraine or you want to develop a more inclusive society, you need to develop a kind of coalition of people who really understands that this is in everyone's collective interest. One of the things, if you let me continue,
sure.
One of the things that brings that together at the time of the Glorious Revolution actually is antagonism over the absence of the rule of law. So one thing that the King, James II, did was, when some judge ruled in a way he didn't like, he'd fire them and put another judge in. And so think about, we're getting together, and I'm trying to start the Glorious Revolution, and I could say to you, Timothy, let's get rid of this guy, James II, and when we're in power, you'll get the legal decisions you like, and I'll get the legal decisions you like. But in some sense, when a lot of people start coming on board, everybody can't get the legal decisions they like. Right. It's a sort of zero-sum thing. I can't give, if you two are in a contest together, you can't both get I can't give you both the legal decisions you like. So in some sense it was sort of, then at some point it's like, well, let's think about it like this. No one gets any favoritism. It's like a level playing field for everybody. And somehow that became the equilibrium, when there was this big collective movement against it. You couldn't replace, what we call the iron law of oligarchy. You couldn't replace, one group in power favoring themselves with a different group in power favoring themselves, what we call the iron law of oligarchy. You had to have a very different sort of equilibrium. So I think it's about coalition building and building bridges and finding, kind of policy dimensions and issues that brings together, people who at the moment are maybe not together in Ukraine, but who, in the end of the day, have a collective interest in a very different type of Ukraine.
But it beautifully coincides with what your colleague, Professor Fukuyama from Stanford University, said in this studio 2 months ago. He hates the notion of political will or the deficit of political will. That's something that we mention in Ukraine so often. There is a deficit of political will. And he said, forget this phrase, you need to build coalitions. And Maidan was a coalition in a way. But two questions on Glorious Revolution still. One, the technical one. So you mentioned it took a couple of centuries before the revolution, but how long did it take after the revolution to complete or to at least to develop these inclusive institutions?
Oh, but that's a very long process. You could, if you wanted to, you could say that went on for another 150 years.
150 years. So Ukrainians, be patient. It's just hopefully minus 25. So it's 125 more years.
But history never repeats itself in the same way. Think about Chinese economic growth. Why is it that China can grow so fast economically? Because it can benefit very easily from hundreds of years of innovation by other countries, So I don't think that historical time tells you anything about how fast Ukraine can or cannot move to an inclusive society today.
And by the way, since you mentioned China, okay, it clearly has an extractionist political system.
Yeah,
but very strong economic growth.
Yeah, but the way we think about China is how do you explain Chinese economic growth? In the 1970s, China was an extremely poor, technologically backward society with extractive economic and political institutions. Economic growth was caused by making the economy much more inclusive. That's the whole story. Dismantling collectivized agriculture, socialist industry, creating incentives, people, opportunities.
Let the thousand flowers bloom, right?
But
in famous Deng Xiaoping phrase.
Right, but what we say is that you can't have an inclusive society when political power is concentrated in the hands of the Communist Party. That, to us, what world history suggests is that concentrated political authority always ends up getting abused to the detriment, of human welfare and the economy. And look at what's happening now. President Xi is creating a personalized, regime. It's the same, a kind of personality cult in the same way Mao Zedong had, And where does that end? Look at human history,
So you're optimist for the world because there are pessimists for the world who say that, look, this model gets replicated. It's replicated in Russia. It's replicated in Turkey. It's replicated in Hungary, to a certain extent in Poland. How about the U.S.?
Yeah, I was going to ask this. Okay, how did the inclusive institutions help? What did not help in the most recent history of the United States?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges to inclusion in the United States. There's always been, when you want to use this dichotomy between inclusive and extractive institutions, you lose the ability to talk about a lot of interesting variation. So Sweden and the United States both have inclusive institutions, but of course, you could say that Sweden is a lot more inclusive than the US because of the historical construction of the US with its history of slavery and marginalization of indigenous and black people. There's huge pockets of, lack of inclusion in the United States, and there always has been. And they've done, the US model does a much worse job at dealing with some types of changes like globalization. It's just that's created an enormous amount of inequality, and there's no mechanism for redistributing it or kind of helping people that suffer. And that's creating populism in the United States. But I would say, if you read about the history of the US Constitution or you read the debates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the US Constitution was designed for Donald Trump. The US Constitution was not designed for Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Barack Obama. It was designed for populists. Madison was very explicit about it. One of the reasons for strengthening the system of checks and balances was exactly because of all the populism in the 1780s, under the Articles of Confederation, which did not have an effective central state, did not have an effective fiscal system. Madison's very clear. You can't design a political system predicated on having good leaders, because you won't. It's the bad leaders that you have to worry about. And the cost is that good leaders can't do everything you'd like them to do because of all the checks and balances. But when you get Donald Trump, then he can't destroy the society like he can do if he gets elected in Venezuela.
British and especially English culture widely differs from Ukrainian, and this is not just an anecdotal evidence. We see a significantly lower power distance is basically how hierarchical the society is. We see much more, another one, individualism. Ukrainian culture is much more collectivist, which partly explains the power distance. And some people, I'm not a scholar on that, but some people explain, by the way, as the result of these two factors, the difference in religion, although both are Christian or dominantly Christian cultures. Ukrainian, obviously, is for a long time is the Orthodox Christian country, while around the same time, by the way, maybe a little bit earlier, England went through the Reformation.
Yeah, 16th. Yeah.
How important is that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of complicated issues you alluded to there. I think when you talk about institutions, we don't just mean the law or the constitution. There's a distinction that social scientists make between formal institutions, written laws and etc., and informal institutions or kind of social norms, that things that, influence our behavior or what we think is the right way to behave or the wrong way to behave, which is enforced, collectively by society or by families or by kinship groups or, whatever it is. So I think those things are important. I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and for me, it's impossible to think about African development without thinking about informal institutions. To go back to the Soviet Union, I was mentioning earlier this idea that the way the Soviet system worked, because there were so many rigidities, was this whole informal system, what do you call it, Blatt, emerged, to get stuff done. So then you have a whole social equilibrium of like ignoring the rules and violating the rules, and everybody thinks that's fine, and and that's just how. But once an equilibrium gets established like that, it's incredibly difficult to change. But I guess the way I think about this is those things are important, but and they also have like complicated historical roots. You mentioned hierarchy in society and social norms about hierarchy or deference, or it might be true. I don't know enough about Ukraine to know how Ukraine is different from England. It might well be. It might be true what you're saying. I don't know, But if I think myself about where did that come from in England, I think that's all part of the same process. If you ever read the novels of Thomas Hardy, for example, 19th century English novels, they're full of incredible hierarchy and classism and social distinctions and the aristocracy. And so to me, leveling the hierarchy and kind of empowering people at the bottom of the hierarchy, that's part of this struggle to create inclusion, which goes all the way back, in Why Nations Fell. We talk about the Black Death in the 14th century, and after the Black Death, the Peasants Revolt, and this kind of massive erosion of feudalism and serfdom in England.
What year was that?
It's the Peasants Revolt is 1381.
So
whereas
we were 500 years behind.
Exactly.
For Ukrainians.
Exactly.
Mind you, we are 500 years behind.
Exactly. So serfdom persists much, much, much longer, in Eastern Europe to the east of the Elbe. And that's a part of the legacy, of the historical legacy of extractive institutions, in this part of the world, and hierarchy. And, but I think, think of female empowerment, or think of, attitudes towards black people, or, laws, can change the way people think, and it can change social norms, and it can promote inclusion and empowerment. And so I don't see, I think, what you're saying, what you're talking about is real, I think, and it's very relevant to the theory. But I guess we see, and part of social norms, in some sense, are evolutionary. It's not kind of by design, like the law might be, or regulation of monopoly might be, or privatizing a monopoly to Carlos Slim. Well, that's all by design. Lots of social norms are not by design. They're just the way society evolves. But I guess our research has always suggested that's not the big. It's important, but it's not the big story. And so we try to stick to what we think is the big story in the book. And the same is true with religion.
And the big story is
about about other institutions. It's not about
inclusive institutions. Okay. The big
political
story is about inclusive institutions.
It's not. You could tell a story where political institutions just reflect this underlying society, but that's not what the evidence suggests to us.
Okay.
It's like the British. Think about the Chinese, okay? The Chinese didn't change their culture or their social norms in 1978. They just started abandoning socialism, and the growth rate went from 0 to 10% a year.
So, Professor, based on everything you researched, and I'm sure it's just a small part which is in the book, and based on our discussion here in the studio, let's move from analytics and description to more prescription. So what should be the recipe for societies like Ukrainian? You mentioned about Armenian. They just went through their revolution.
Yeah.
What should be done? What should be the action plan?
Well, to have an action plan, you need to know much more about the Ukraine than I do. I mean, that's where all the details become extremely important. I would say what you need is, some reflection and kind of understanding of what the problem is, what the underlying deep problem is. And I think in many of these contexts, there's always a danger of confusing the symptoms with the causes, so that I've noticed, there's an obsession with corruption here. Okay. So I understand why there's an obsession with corruption, but to me, corruption occurs because of malfunctioning institutions, because of malfunctioning state institutions, because it's not a state of rules, it's a state of deals and discretion and patronage and
relationships.
So corruption reflects the underlying logic of the state and the way the people running the state organize power and authority. So, if you put pressure on corruption, then maybe that helps push society in the right direction. If you create a better procurement system, that helps push society in the right direction.
But that's exactly what we did with the advice of your colleague, Professor Acemoglu, in 2014. Cleaning up the procurement system.
So I think that's all a good thing, but I always feel that it's a very indirect way, maybe, of tackling what the fundamental problems are. And you need a plan for trying to address those fundamental problems in the exercise of authority, the way the state works, the enormous challenges to kind of accountability and transparency in the political system that you seem to have here.
What should we start with in that case? I mean, I understand that your first time in Ukraine. We're so happy to see you here. I understand that you cannot give a profound advice. But so you say that procurement is probably not the best. I mean, not the best place to start.
No, it's not a magic wand.
There's no magic wand. We know it.
Yeah. I think if you look at the progress that's been made in Ukraine, since 1990, this period since 2014 seems to have been the most rapid progress that the society was going backwards in some sense, before that. And so that's something to really celebrate and be proud of, it seems to me. And that was civil society that did that, So I would say that that's where I would start. Think about the media, transparency, civil society. How can civil society organize more effectively to push the government to solve some of these problems? Yeah, and the government has solved some of the problems. There have been judicial reforms. There have been all of this information revealed about people's assets, and there's obviously a kind of reluctance. There's all sorts of conflict. Huge
reluctance and resistance. Obviously,
but it's civil society that's forcing that to happen. So that's something very exciting, and somehow that needs to be consolidated. I mean, the problem with Maidan, it's always difficult to institutionalize a moment like that. The most obvious way is through political parties, but the party system seems very fragmented. There seems to be a lot of residues from the pre-Maidan political system. And, so I guess I would also think about how could you deepen accountability? There seems to be a lot of money in politics in the Ukraine. And, and one of my concerns would be at the moment also, thinking about other parts of the world I know well, is that, the war with Russia, on the one hand, you could say, well, that creates a sort of, it deepens the chance that some sort of common project will emerge, that people will bury their differences and their self-interest in the interest of building Ukraine and building Ukrainian institutions. But it also throws a lot of populism into politics, which distracts people from what the real issues are. So I don't know how that will play out 2019. Whether people will really have a serious debate in the elections about what this country needs to go forward, or whether they'll just have a debate about who's the best nationalist, who's the most Ukrainian.
Which is, by the way, happening. On the personal academic note, Professor, concluding this interview, what's your next book? What's your current research interest?
We'll be doing many things, but Professor Acemoglu and I will be publishing another book next year. The title keeps changing, but at the moment the title is called The Narrow Corridor to Liberty, and it's much more about how is it that countries that built effective accountability authority did it? How did they do it? Like trying to look much more at the historical dynamics of successes and failures, so I think responding to a lot of the questions and criticisms that we've got in Why Nations Fail, that we were not detailed enough or explicit enough about that. So
is Ukraine in that book?
Not yet, but it isn't finished yet.
It isn't finished. What a beautiful note to finish, actually, this interview. Professor, thank you very much. And it was Professor Robinson from Chicago University, the co-author of famous bestseller, Why Nations Fail. I was also assisted by Professor Milovanov from Kiev School of Economics. And dear Ukrainians, I mean, here's a challenge to all of us. The book is unfinished yet, and I guess, I know professors, they always want to have an additional, bright, illuminating example. Let that example from Ukraine be not of failure. Let that example be of success. It's in our hands. We are building those coalitions. We have to push that process forward and move from the extractionist political and economic system into the inclusive ones, level the field, given access, the equal access to the resources and the markets, protect competition, fight corruption. We know this agenda. Professor, you want to add something to this?
No, that sounds exactly right.
That sounds exactly right. See, we try to be good disciples, Professor. Thank you very much, and I wish you a pleasant stay in Ukraine, and I'm sure and hopefully this is not your last time. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Радио НВ.